On the morning of Sunday, June 17th, 2018, 35-year-old Tristan Baudet pulled his phone out of his pocket to check the weather forecast for Orange County, California. Orange County is this beautiful suburb located right between Los Angeles and San Diego. And this beautiful suburb is where Tristan and his wife, 36-year-old Erica Wu, and their two young daughters, aged 2 and 4, called home. And on this day, which was Father's Day, Tristan had gotten up early to check the weather to make sure it was going to be clear that day because he really wanted to take his family out for a fun beach day to celebrate his holiday. And he was in luck because when his app loaded, it showed that Orange County was going to be beautiful and clear all day. Although, even if the weather had come back as rainy and horrible and cold, Tristan was the kind of person who still would have wanted to go to the beach. Because for Tristan, anything outdoors was really awesome. That was his happy place, being out in nature. Whether it was going to the beach or going hiking or camping or just throwing a frisbee around outside, he didn't care. If he was outside, he was good with it. And even though his daughters were still very young, they both already had totally fallen in love with nature just like their dad had, which made Tristan just so happy because now he had these two little sidekicks that would go with him on all of his outdoor adventures. As for Tristan's wife, Erica, she did love the outdoors, but maybe not as much as Tristan did. But that was okay with Tristan because all he would do is make little adjustments to his adventures to make it more bearable for Erica. Like whenever they went camping, Tristan would totally rough it in a tent right on the ground, but he would bring along a big full-size blow-up mattress for his wife. And this was something that Erica just adored about Tristan. Not that he literally waited on her hand and foot, but rather that Tristan just kind of went with the flow. If his wife wanted a blow-up mattress, that was fine. It didn't matter to him. That was just who he was. He didn't judge people. He was at peace with the world. And in fact, it was that character trait that had originally attracted Erica to Tristan. Erica had met Tristan back in high school when some mutual friends had set them up. Tristan didn't have a date to a dance at his school, and so the friends were kind of like, Erica, go with him. And so Erica would agree to go. And on the night, she actually met Tristan for the first time. She's laying eyes on him for the first time. He was a sight to behold. The summer prior, he had sprouted up like 4 inches or so. So he's super tall, but his body hadn't quite filled out yet. So he's super lanky looking, and he was totally overdressed for this dance. He had on this full tuxedo, and he was not remotely self-conscious. He was only psyched to have a date to this dance. And during this dance, Tristan would just totally rock that tuxedo in all of his gangly glory, as if this tuxedo was made for him. And he would really try hard to make sure that Erica had a good time with him, and she totally did. And so after this dance was over, the pair was inseparable. Erica would go on to study at Stanford and would become an OBGYN doctor. As for Tristan, he would become this wildly successful, widely published scientist with a patent related to vaccine delivery. However, in typical Tristan fashion, he didn't care at all about his resume. It didn't matter that it was completely stacked. I mean, on paper, this guy was just unbelievable. But Tristan never changed his personality. He never changed anything about himself. In fact, his scientist colleagues who adored him, they used to think it was hysterical that this brilliant chemist who was on the cutting edge of various cancer treatments and all this crazy research, that guy was actually this big mellow type person who wandered around the lab and started most of his sentences with, "Dude." By early afternoon on that Father's Day in 2018, Erica and Tristan and their 2 little girls had made their way to a local beach, and Erica had found herself sitting in a beach chair reading a book, and Tristan and the girls had set up a sunshade right down where the water broke, and they were digging in the sand. And so over the course of that afternoon, Erica, she's reading her book, and periodically she would look up and she would see Tristan and the girls digging in the sand or making sand castles. And then at some point, Tristan and the girls, they would get up and abandon their dig site, and they would run into the water, and then they would run back to shore right as the waves were breaking, trying to kind of escape the waves. And the 2 little girls thought this was so much fun, and they were laughing hysterically and screeching with excitement as the waves crashed at their ankles. These are tiny little waves. And at some point, Erica, she's looking up watching this, and she sees her 2 little girls having a blast, and she sees her husband flash her this big grin because he knows this is totally funny. And at that moment, Erica suddenly felt herself feel something that she didn't always feel these days. and that was just contentedness, happiness. Tristan, because he was this totally laid-back guy, he was able to just kind of enjoy life as it came to him. But Erica, she couldn't do that. She was a constant worrier, and that was largely because when she was just 8 years old, she lost her father. And it was this totally traumatic experience that really upset her childhood. It was just devastating for the family. And so ever since then, she had developed this very real paranoia that no matter how good her life was, that at any second it was going to be ruined by something horrible happening to her. But as she sat in this chair, watching her husband smiling at her and seeing her kids playing with him, it was just this perfect moment. And so Erica would put the book down and she would get up and run into the surf to be with her family. Little did she know, something horrible was about to happen. 4 days later, on June 21st, Erica was home studying for this big medical exam she was scheduled to take the next day. But at the house with her was her husband and her 2 little girls. And so the house was totally chaotic and loud, and it was obvious to Tristan as he looked over at his wife that she was really struggling to focus. And Tristan also knew that they were a week away from moving. They were moving to San Francisco. They had just put a deposit down on a house. They had some family up there, so it was a smart move to make. But they still had a lot to do for this move. And so Tristan's looking at his wife knowing that, the stress levels have got to be through the roof for her. And so Tristan decided he would just take the girls and head out for the weekend to make sure Erica had the time and space she needed to prepare for this test, and also just maybe to be alone and have some peace and quiet. And so Tristan made a couple of phone calls, and then after he was done, he talked to Erica and he told her that he had just made reservations at this campsite up in Malibu, California. Malibu is another beautiful Southern California town located about an hour and a half north of Orange County. It's where a lot of celebrities live. It's a very rich part of California. And he tells Erica that he had made reservations in this campground that's out there, and that he had called his brother-in-law named Scott, who had 2 young kids himself, ages 3 and 5, and they were all going to go there together and spend the weekend at this campsite. Now, Erica was very thankful for her husband for being willing to do this because she did need the time and space to study, but she immediately was just concerned about it because, Tristan, he would take the girls and go out on all sorts of adventures all the time, but he had never gone camping overnight without her there, and so her reaction was to worry about it. But Tristan, who knew his wife very well, told her, "Don't worry, I will take great care of the kids. It's a place that's totally public. It's an amazing campground. There's loads of people around. It's totally safe." And so eventually Erica was convinced. And so Tristan began packing the car with all the camping supplies and the kids' toys and the kids' bikes. And as he's doing that, and the girls are really excited about this camping trip, Erica still found herself thinking, I hope they cancel this trip, because she just couldn't help feeling like something bad was about to happen to them. But Tristan did not cancel the trip, and after the car was all packed and the girls had been tucked into their car seats in the back seat, Tristan kissed Erica goodbye and said he would see her in a couple of days, and good luck on your test tomorrow. And with that, Tristan hopped into the car, he backed out of the driveway, and Erica watched as he pulled up the road and headed north towards Malibu. After studying well into the night, Erica finally went to sleep, and then the next morning she got up early because she was nervous about the test, she was anxious about her husband and her kids, and so she's up early and she's getting ready, and as she's getting ready, she hears a loud knock on the front door. She looks at her clock and she sees it's 6:45 in the morning, and there was no reason for anybody to be knocking on her door that early in the morning, maybe unless it was Tristan, but he wouldn't be knocking on the door, he'd just be coming inside. And so apprehensively, she walked out of her room and went to the front of the house, and then she opened the front door. And as soon as she saw who was standing there, she knew something was wrong. This video is sponsored by BetterHelp. Every day, I spend hours and hours poring over every little detail of one tragedy after the next to find my next topic. And then once I've settled on a topic, I often get so connected to the victim or victims in the story. I see my mom, I see my wife, I see my kids in these people, and it's just devastating by the time I'm actually done with the story. But telling these people's stories is very important to me. And so I knew if I was going to do this long term, I needed needed to prioritize my mental health. And so in 2020, I sought out a therapist on a highly reviewed online therapy platform called BetterHelp to try to help me handle the darkness of the type of content that I make. And I can tell you, I was not disappointed. BetterHelp offers licensed therapists that are trained to listen and help you. BetterHelp allows you to talk to your therapist in a private online environment at your convenience. All you have to do is fill out their questionnaire that helps assess your specific needs, and then within 48 hours, you're paired with your therapist. Then you simply schedule a secure video or phone session when you're ready. Plus, you can exchange unlimited messages with your therapist, and all of it is kept confidential. And at any time, if you want to change your therapist, it's easy to do so, and it comes at no cost. So if you're dealing with darkness in your life, I highly suggest BetterHelp. Join the 2 million plus who have taken charge of their mental health with an experienced BetterHelp therapist. That's BetterHelp.com. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/MrBallen. It's also linked below in the description. Erica would later reflect on this moment when she opened the door. And even though it didn't make sense and it was irrational, she would sometimes think to herself, what if I had just never opened the door? Would this nightmare have really happened? But Erica did open the door, and standing out there was her sister-in-law, Priscilla, who was there unannounced. She lived an hour and a half away, and she looked very frazzled and upset, and she would give Erica absolutely heartbreaking news. News that was so earth-shattering that Erica literally couldn't comprehend it. Like, this cannot be true. There literally has to be a mistake. But there was no mistake. Erica would not take her medical exam that day. Instead, she would hop into the car with Priscilla and they would drive to Malibu. The day before, Tristan and his two little girls, after driving for about an hour and a half, arrived in Malibu at the entrance to the Malibu Creek State Park. Now, when most people think of Malibu, they just think of the beautiful properties lining the beach. They think of celebrities and rich people and exclusivity. And that's all true. But what a lot of people don't know about Malibu is that just outside of the kind of main Malibu area is this totally wild area, this very rugged terrain, all these canyons, all these heavily forested areas. It all kind of butts up against the outside of Malibu. And in this totally rugged area is where the Malibu Creek State Park is. So Tristan and Scott, they arrive at the gates of this park that leads into this wilderness, and they check in with the park rangers up front, and they are directed to their respective campsites that they had reserved. They had reserved 2 sites right next to each other. And all a campsite is usually is just a square little plot of land with nothing in it. And it's a place where you put your tent on, and sometimes there's a fire pit inside of it. It's really sparse. And so Tristan and Scott, they thank the park ranger. They drive all the way across the campgrounds. They get to their designated spots. And right away, Tristan's like, these are just not very good campsites. They were located right near the porta potties, so it kind of smelled bad, and there was lots of foot traffic right in front of their sites, and their site was kind of at a tilt too, so just overall it was not ideal. And so Tristan said this to Scott, and Scott decided he would just go talk to the park rangers again and see if they could change their campsites. And so he went to the front, talks to the park ranger, and they say, no problem, there's actually 2 open campsites on the other side of the park. We'll just swap your reservation. And so Tristan and Scott and the kids, they make their way to these other 2 campsites, and these are perfect. They're kind of tucked up at the base of this huge canyon. There are no porta potties nearby, so no foot traffic. It's very private, and the land was totally flat. And so the men are totally happy with this, and they start getting their stuff out of their vehicles and setting up their tents, and the kids are running around playing and riding their little bikes around. And then after their campsites were mostly set up, Scott and Tristan made a fire in the fire pit that was located roughly between where the 2 tents had been set up. And so Scott was sleeping with his 2 sons in his tent, and Tristan would be sleeping with his 2 girls in his tent. And so they get this big fire going, and then all the kids and the adults, they sit around the fire, and they start roasting hot dogs and making s'mores, which is marshmallow, chocolate, and graham cracker, and the dads are telling funny jokes and spooky stories too. And before long, the kids are just totally exhausted, and so Scott and Tristan both take their kids and put them to bed inside of their tents. And then after the kids are tucked in, the 2 men come back to the fire, and Tristan, who had packed pre-made cocktails, he pulls those out and he shares one with Scott, and then the 2 men just enjoyed each other's company, sat around the campfire, chatted for a while. It was mostly Tristan talking about his upcoming move to San Francisco, but Scott was happy to just listen. And then at some point, the two men were just totally exhausted and they decided it was time for them to go to bed. And so they put out the fire. Scott would hug Tristan and tell him that he loved him. And then the two men would leave the campfire and go to their respective tents. As Scott climbed into his tent with his two sons, he turned and looked out the open flap of his tent across the fire pit towards Tristan's tent. And he saw Tristan climb into the tent with his girls. And so after he sees Tristan get into his tent, Scott zips up his own tent and he lies down, and within 10 or 15 minutes, Scott is fast asleep. Just before sunrise the next day, so around 4:45 a.m., Scott suddenly woke up. He thought he heard a loud sound, but he couldn't place the sound. And so he's just laying there. It's still dark outside. And as he's kind of getting his bearings, he realizes one of Tristan's daughters is crying in her tent. Now, this was not cause for alarm necessarily, because Scott just thought, whatever she was upset about, Tristan would certainly calm her down any minute and she'd be okay. But as Scott was laying there with his two sons sleeping right next to him, Tristan's daughter just continued to cry. Now, Tristan was a famously heavy sleeper, and so Scott was thinking, okay, he just must not be awake, and so that's why he's not able to comfort his daughter. And so Scott would carefully get up, he'd unzip his tent, he'd be careful not to step on his sons. He went outside, and outside it's cold, it's dark, he cannot see inside of Tristan's tent. There's no windows on it. And so he just walks over, and by the time he gets to the tent, he can hear clear as day Tristan's daughter is still crying. And so Scott kind of loudly but still whispering says, "Hey, Tristan, wake up." But Tristan doesn't wake up. And so with Tristan's daughter still crying right on the other side of the nylon of this tent, Scott decides to just open the tent up and look inside. And so he walks around to the front of the tent, he unzips the tent, and he looks inside. Now, it's too dark, he can't really tell what he's looking at, but even with the minimal light, he could tell that Tristan was clearly still sleeping right in the middle of the tent. And positioned on either side of him was his 2-year-old daughter and his 4-year-old daughter. And from the looks of it, the 2-year-old was crying, and the 4-year-old, who was also whimpering, was doing her best to comfort the 2-year-old. And so Scott's looking in, wondering what's going on, when the two little girls, they turn and look up at Scott, and when they see him, they just start saying, "Wet, wet, wet." Now, Scott doesn't know what they're talking about. He's starting to get a little bit flustered because he thinks something's wrong. And so he reaches in and just starts shaking Tristan, saying, "Hey, wake up." But as soon as he did that, he could tell Tristan's not sleeping. Tristan is dead, and his two little girls are sitting in a pool of his blood. Right before Scott had woken up, someone who was standing near the campsite had fired a gun several times, and one of their bullets went into Tristan's tent and struck him right in the head as he slept next to his daughters. Roughly 2 hours after Tristan was killed, Priscilla showed up on Tristan's doorstep to tell his wife, Erica, what happened, that her little girls were about to grow up without a father, just like she did. This news absolutely destroyed Erica. A 42-year-old man named Anthony Rauda would be arrested and charged with Tristan's murder. Rauda had a long criminal history, and at the time of Tristan's murder, he was living illegally in this park up in the canyon nearby, and when he was arrested, he was in possession of a gun that was ballistically linked to the bullet that killed Tristan. His trial is still ongoing because Rauda keeps firing his defense attorneys, which delays the trial. While Rauda has said he's innocent, he didn't do this, his behavior in court so far has not made him look any more innocent. He has been so violent and erratic during the initial court proceedings that when he goes into court, they have to strap his wrists and his legs into a chair and put what's called a spit hood over his head, which prevents him from spitting on people and biting people. Assuming he was the shooter, that he was responsible for shooting Tristan, which most people believe he was, and there really is an enormous amount of evidence that supports this, but again, his trial is still ongoing. But if we assume he was the shooter, the theory is it was completely random. He did not know Tristan. He basically just fired his gun either intentionally into the tent or recklessly, and he just happened to fire into the tent. But either way, one of his bullets struck Tristan in the head and killed him, meaning Tristan was literally just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if this case wasn't heartbreaking enough, One more distressing detail is that this shooting was not the first shooting in or around this campground. In the year leading up to Tristan's death, there were an astounding 6 other shootings, 2 of which happened literally in the campground right where Tristan was killed. Now, none of these other shootings were fatal, but in all 6 cases, the shooter or shooters were never caught, and the Malibu police just kind of didn't investigate. It wasn't until Tristan got shot and killed in this campground that the stories of all these other shootings that never got solved came out, and people are looking on a map saying, wait a minute, there's all these shootings unsolved with a rogue shooter or shooters out and about right here, right over this campground, and we haven't shut down the campground, and we haven't told the public that there's potentially an uncaught shooter roaming around this campground? Why is that? Now, the answers to those questions we don't know now, but they will likely come out during Anthony Rauda's trial, where he's being charged not only with killing Tristan, but also for all of those other shootings. In the meantime, Erica has filed a $90 million lawsuit against several agencies, saying that her husband had no idea there was this threat of an uncaught shooter at that campground, and had authorities put any sort of warning up, Tristan never would have taken his kids inside of that park, and he would be alive today. Her lawsuit is still ongoing. During the COVID-19 lockdown in 2020, Caroline Daniels stood in her backyard in suburban Iowa, watching her husband, Brian, blow up a small bouncy house that she just bought on Amazon. Brian had nearly gotten the thing inflated. They'd all been cooped up in the house for over a month because of the pandemic, so it was a godsend that the weather was nice and they'd gotten something fun for the kids to do outside. The moment the bouncy house was inflated, Andrew and Robin went running to it and piled inside with their dad. They screamed and giggled as their father bounced around them, launching them a few feet into the air every time. Caroline smiled and went back into the kitchen, where their nanny was cutting up some veggie sticks for a snack. She was about to grab a knife and help when the screaming outside turned from fun to painful. Caroline dashed back outside and found her husband kneeling next to Andrew. The little 4-year-old was curled up on his side, sobbing with pain. Caroline helped Brian scoop Andrew into his arms, then followed them inside. Brian laid Andrew on the sofa in the living room so that he and Caroline could try to figure out if the boy had any broken bones. But after a minute of prodding, Caroline felt sure that nothing was seriously wrong. Besides, Brian assured her that Andrew hadn't landed hard or anything. He just bounced a little, then started screaming. This whole situation definitely seemed odd, but Caroline assumed that, he must have just landed at an odd angle or something. She gave him some Motrin to help with the pain, and after a few minutes, Andrew did calm down. And by dinner time, he was back to his usual happy-go-lucky self. By the following morning, Caroline had put the whole bouncy house incident out of her mind. She left Brian watching the kids while she hopped on a morning Zoom call for work. Halfway through the call, though, Caroline heard a piercing scream in the yard. It was Andrew again. She turned off her camera and raced downstairs. By the time she got to the backyard, the nanny was kneeling beside Andrew, who was once again in the fetal position and crying. Caroline asked if Andrew had fallen down, but the nanny said no. He was just standing there, and then he suddenly yelped and fell to the ground, and Andrew had been crying ever since. Caroline couldn't tell if Andrew was truly in pain or if he was just having a meltdown. She picked up her son and asked what was wrong, but it was clear he was in no mood to talk. He just cried. Caroline wasn't sure what to make of it. Andrew was not the kind of little boy to throw temper tantrums, but she also knew that every child gets overwhelmed sometimes. Besides, he hadn't seen his friends in months because of the COVID lockdown, and he was tired of being at home all the time, and so Caroline decided he must just be having a moment. Still, she gave him another Motrin, and about 15 minutes later, Andrew was back to normal. It suddenly occurred to Caroline that Andrew's molars might be coming in, which could be extremely painful. Once he was outside playing with the nanny again, she picked up the phone to call his dentist. A few weeks later, an orthodontist named Dr. Tyson Graham sat down on a stool in his treatment room and turned to face little Andrew, who was sitting up in the examination chair. Andrew's mom was in the corner, looking anxious. Dr. Graham smiled at her, then explained to Andrew how he was going to try to help the little boy with the pain he'd been experiencing lately. Andrew's regular dentist had already taken x-rays of Andrew's mouth and found that Andrew had been grinding his teeth at night. Teeth grinding can cause difficulty breathing at night, and the dentist thought that might explain why Andrew had been so moody and exhausted recently. He wasn't sleeping well. So the dentist had referred Andrew to Dr. Graham, thinking that the orthodontist might find a way to prevent the boy's teeth grinding. But as Dr. Graham examined Andrew's mouth, he found a different issue. Andrew's palate, the roof of his mouth, was too narrow for his age. In Dr. Graham's opinion, that, not teeth grinding, was what was making it difficult for Andrew to breathe at night. He turned to Caroline and explained that if Andrew had a wider palate, he'd very likely feel better. They could put an expander in Andrew's mouth for a couple of months to push the palate out. Caroline looked nervous, but Dr. Tyson explained that the expander wasn't that different from getting braces, and it would definitely help Andrew breathe better. Caroline still looked unsure, but she agreed. Dr. Graham nodded and then went to get a few supplies to install the palate expander. A month later, Caroline squeezed into the bathroom with Andrew and Robin, squirting little dabs of bubblegum toothpaste onto their toothbrushes. Then all three of them brushed their teeth together, a little bedtime routine they'd fallen into recently. Mostly, this was so Caroline could make sure they actually did it, but it was also to make sure Andrew used the special mouthwash she had bought him to keep his palate expander nice and clean. Caroline was tired, and she could tell her kids were exhausted too. They'd spent all day outside, playing a socially distanced version of hide-and-seek they'd made up with the neighborhood kids. Caroline was glad to see Andrew back to his old self. It seemed like the palate expander had really worked. As the kids got into their pajamas, Andrew asked if his mother would measure them against the doorframe in their bedroom. Caroline smiled. She had been marking their heights there since they were old enough to stand. Robin chimed in that she wanted to be measured too. Caroline knew why there was suddenly all this interest in being measured. The neighborhood kids had been bragging about how tall they'd gotten, so of course her kids wanted to know too. Caroline told Robin to stand against the door jamb and carefully marked her height with a pencil. When Robin stepped away, it looked like she had grown a full inch since they'd last measured her. Caroline wrote the date on the jamb as Robin grinned. Then it was Andrew's turn. But after she measured him and Andrew stepped away, it looked like he had barely grown at all. Andrew frowned, looking at his sister's mark with a tinge of jealousy. Caroline assured him he would grow by next month, but she knew this was unusual for a 4-year-old kid. He should be growing like a weed. And so she decided she would make an appointment with the pediatrician in the morning, just to make sure nothing was wrong. But later that week, Caroline felt frustrated as she paced her kitchen, listening while Andrew's pediatrician explained over the phone that Andrew was not growing because of the pandemic. The stress of all the isolation and fear was negatively affecting Andrew's growth, and unfortunately, because they were still in the pandemic, there really wasn't much they could do. They should just wait it out for a few months. But as she hung up the phone, she felt certain that something was wrong with Andrew, and it had nothing to do with COVID-19. In early 2021, about 9 months after Andrew first started experiencing these sudden bouts of extreme pain, Caroline took him back to his pediatrician for a follow-up. She let Andrew walk ahead of her into the office. She intentionally trailed behind him a little so she could watch his stride. She saw he was dragging his left foot instead of picking it up and actually stepping with it. He'd been doing this whole past week. It was like his right foot was doing all the walking and his left foot was just along for the ride. At this point, it was another symptom to add to the list. Over the past few months, Andrew had been having headaches and meltdowns again. Besides that, he seemed exhausted all the time. The Motrin still helped somewhat, but Caroline could see him getting more solemn and less playful with each passing day. She knew her baby was in pain, and it had to be due to something other than his narrow palate or the pandemic. Caroline had taken him to several doctors, trying to get some answers. A neurologist had told her that Andrew had migraines, while an ear, nose, and throat doctor still believed her son was having breathing issues while sleeping, and so he likely couldn't fall into a deep, undisturbed sleep, which explained why he was so tired. But to Caroline, none of these doctors were addressing the root problem. She felt like each doctor was focusing on one single symptom, but nobody was taking a step back to see the whole picture. What was the underlying condition or disease that was causing all these symptoms? And until somebody could put all the puzzle pieces together, Andrew would be the one suffering. But no matter how many times she tried to communicate this with all the doctors and specialists, it was like nobody seemed to understand. Caroline felt like she was losing her mind, but all she could do was just keep going to more doctors. and so she'd taken Andrew back to his pediatrician's office, hoping maybe he might finally have a real answer for her. While the pediatrician measured Andrew's height and weight, Caroline went through all of Andrew's symptoms. She expected the doctor to offer some kind of overarching explanation. Instead, he just stood upright and told her there was good news. Andrew had grown a bit since his last appointment. Caroline supposed that was good, but the rest of Andrew's symptoms showed no improvement whatsoever. And on the whole, Andrew wasn't feeling good. He was still in pain. And now there was this lazy foot issue. She wanted to know how they could start actively helping her son, instead of just tracking all his symptoms. The pediatrician suggested that Caroline put her son in physical therapy to correct his foot imbalance. He promised to write a referral. Caroline thanked him, though secretly she felt overwhelmed by how many appointments this would likely add to their already doctor-heavy calendar. But it just felt like there was nothing else she could do. She had to go through with it. So she smiled and promised the doctor she would get Andrew into therapy soon. Later that week, while Andrew was going through his physical therapy routine, Caroline, who was in the room watching him, felt uneasy. Andrew's therapist, Miss Ashley, was walking Andrew through an examination. Caroline smiled as Andrew walked around the room with a determined look on his face. Miss Ashley took notes and told him he was doing a great job. Then Miss Ashley asked him to sit cross-legged on the floor. Andrew tried, but he couldn't quite get his legs to cross over one another. One leg would bend, but he couldn't bend his other leg enough to sit upright. Before long, he got frustrated and told Miss Ashley he couldn't do it. Miss Ashley said that was okay, and then they moved on to other activities. After a session was over, Andrew came running over to his mom, and Caroline scooped him up. She let him rest his head on her shoulder, and then Miss Ashley came over and explained that Andrew might have a congenital condition called Chiari malformation. That's when a part of the brain, called the cerebellum, bulges through an opening at the back of the skull, right where the skull joins the spinal canal. The bulge puts pressure on the cerebellum and the spinal cord. It can cause severe headaches, scoliosis, and sleep apnea, which is when breathing becomes interrupted during sleep. If Andrew did have a Chiari malformation, he could need surgery. The thought sent a shiver through Caroline. She never thought that Andrew might need to be cut open. She hated picturing it, and she had no idea how she was going to explain it to him. The following winter, in 2022, Caroline was in Andrew's bedroom helping him into his pajamas, the same pair of red flannel pajamas that he'd been wearing for 2 years now. It felt like his sister Robin outgrew her clothes every few months, but Andrew hadn't needed new pajamas or t-shirts since before COVID. Andrew was 6 years old now, but he still looked like he was closer to 4, and this evening he was throwing a tantrum like a bona fide toddler. But Caroline didn't blame him. After dinner, she and Brian had taken Andrew out for ice cream and broke the news. Because of what was going on with him, he had to quit his hockey team. The skating was causing too much pain in his knees and back. It was just too much for his underdeveloped body. At first, Caroline just felt heartbroken for making Andrew so sad. But now, she was so frustrated, she was becoming angry at all the doctors. She was tired of having to tell Andrew that nobody knew why his body was failing him. The latest theory, that Andrew had Chiari malformation, wasn't right either. Andrew had tested negative for the condition last year. Since then, Caroline and Brian had taken their son to countless more specialists. A new pediatrician for a second opinion, a pediatric internist, even an adult internist, just in case they found something different. In total, Andrew had seen 17 different doctors over the last 3 years. But all those doctors were still stuck in a cycle of treating his symptoms individually. Caroline finally got Andrew into bed, though it broke her heart to leave him red-faced and tear-streaked, his little arms wrapped around his favorite stuffed animal. She went downstairs and started scrolling on her phone just to decompress. A Facebook friend had posted an article that looked interesting about a new artificial intelligence software called ChatGPT. You could ask it any question, no matter how complex, and it would scan the whole internet in a matter of seconds to generate an answer. People were using it to create marketing plans for their companies, to write blog posts, and to make mashups like fairy tales written in the style of a mafia movie, or resignation letters if they were written by famous TV characters. It seemed like a fun way to spend an hour, so Caroline started messing around with ChatGPT. When Brian came into the living room and sat down next to her on the sofa, she read him some of the funniest mashups it had made. Brian laughed and then joked that she should try to use it to diagnose Andrew. Caroline laughed dismissively, but then she wondered. It was a long shot, but why not? Maybe ChatGPT would find some rare, obscure disease that most specialists had never heard of. Or maybe it would unearth some clue, some pivotal question to ask that would help one of his doctors see the whole picture. The worst that could happen was nothing, really. So Caroline started typing all of Andrew's symptoms into ChatGPT. She even went and got her copy of medical notes from an MRI he'd gotten and typed them in, line by line. It was a tedious process, especially doing it on her phone, but eventually when she was done, she hit enter and waited. A few moments later, the little text box started suggesting possible answers, but they were all conditions that Andrew had already been tested for. Caroline's heart sank. She felt stupid for thinking this brand new internet AI chat box could magically diagnose her child, but then she realized she actually had left out one of his symptoms, the fact that he could no longer sit cross-legged. She told ChatGPT to redo the search, including that symptom, and within moments, it suggested a condition that she'd never heard of, and none of Andrew's doctors had ever mentioned it either. But as she started reading the symptoms of this condition aloud, Brian sat up straight, his eyes going wide. He ran to get his laptop, and Caroline started researching on her phone. Eventually, she found a Facebook group for families living with and caring for those with this condition, and to her surprise, their stories were nearly identical to Andrew's. A week later, Caroline was bursting with anticipation as she sat next to Andrew in a brand new doctor's office. They were waiting to see Dr. Hannah Gordon, a pediatric neurosurgeon. Caroline had brought a packet of research with her and had it waiting on her lap for when the doctor came in. She hoped that by the end of the appointment, Dr. Gordon would be able to officially diagnose Andrew and that Caroline would finally know what was wrong with her son. When Dr. Gordon finally came into the exam room, Caroline introduced herself and explained that usually she was not one to surf the internet and self-diagnose, but she'd actually found some compelling evidence online. And then she handed over the research packet she'd compiled, and she watched the doctor read over it. When Dr. Gordon laid eyes on Andrew's MRI scans, she smiled and told Caroline that she was fairly certain she did know how to help Andrew. Dr. Gordon explained that Andrew was suffering from a condition called tethered cord syndrome, the same condition that ChatGPT had identified. The spinal cord runs like a cable through the bones that make up the spine, from the base of the skull to the tailbone. However, in rare cases, the spinal cord improperly attaches itself to something inside the bones of the spinal column. As a result, the spinal cord's movement is limited. In short, it gets stuck. Andrew's spinal cord was stuck to one of those growing spinal bones, causing him extreme pain and all his other symptoms. It was also why he couldn't sit cross-legged, a symptom that's so common among people with tethered cord syndrome that ChatGPT recognized the pattern. Caroline believes that ChatGPT was able to diagnose Andrew because it was doing the very thing she had spent years asking doctors to do. It took a step back and considered all of Andrew's symptoms, instead of picking and choosing or focusing on them one by one. Luckily for Andrew, he was able to undergo surgery to detach his spinal cord from where it was stuck. Once the tension was gone, Andrew's symptoms soon disappeared, and he went back to his happy-go-lucky self. For real this time. Just before 8 p.m. on September 3, 1981, 31-year-old Linda Slayton stood in her kitchen in Lakeland, Florida, staring into her cupboard. It was almost completely empty, except for a few cans of beans and a bag of flour. And seeing this gave Linda a pit in her stomach, because she knew she would somehow have to turn these sparse ingredients into a meal for her kids. Linda was a single mother of 2 boys, Jeff, who was 15, and Tim, who was 12. And Linda didn't have very much money. And so in order to take care of her kids, she had to be resourceful, like, finding a way to make food with whatever ingredients she had, and she also would make her kids their own clothing, anything to save money. Now, up until a few weeks ago, the family had lived in Alabama, but Linda had moved to Lakeland specifically because she had a lot of family and support there. And so Linda had hoped that, because of that support, that, her and her son's lives would, improve quite a bit. It wouldn't feel like such a struggle all the time anymore. But so far, the move to Lakeland had just been more of the same. Linda couldn't find a steady job, so she and the boys had been relying on government assistance and food stamps, which never seemed to be enough to keep these two teenagers well fed. And tonight, Linda's youngest son, Tim, was about to be dropped off after being at football practice, and historically, he was very hungry after practice, and so she really wanted to have dinner ready for him. And on top of that, Linda was hopeful that Tim and her other son, Jeff, would eat fast enough that they would have enough time to make it to a neighbor's housewarming party later that night. So all the neighbors around Linda were basically as new as she was, since the complex they lived in had only been open for about 3 weeks. It was the sprawling development with about 80 one-story duplexes that were technically government-subsidized housing, but it felt more like classic suburbia, since the units were on cul-de-sacs with neat lawns where all the kids would go outside and play. Now, Linda's sister also lived in this complex, so Linda already knew at least one person. But to Linda, making friends of her own was also pretty important to her. She was an outgoing person by nature. And also, she was newly single and wanted to take her mind off her ex-boyfriend. Until recently, Linda had been dating this guy named Brendan Fowler, who had been great at first and was even the one who told her about this apartment complex. But he'd started to get really controlling and possessive, and just 2 days ago, Linda had finally ended things. But believe it or not, Linda actually felt sort of hopeful. She had believed that by leaving Alabama and moving to Florida into this complex, that would sort of be the refresh that she and her kids desperately needed. But the truth was, it sort of seemed like actually the true reset had been the breakup with Brendan just a couple of days earlier. Like it all needed to happen, all this big change in order for their lives to really get on the right track. And so, feeling optimistic, Linda looked into the cupboard at her limited ingredients and suddenly realized she could actually do a quick bean casserole with just these couple of things. So she grabbed the cans and the flour, and she got started. About a half an hour later, Linda pulled a beautiful golden brown casserole out of the oven and set it on the counter to cool. And that's when her older son, Jeff, wandered into the kitchen to see if dinner was ready. Linda told him it was, but they needed to wait for Tim to get home from football first. And when she said that, Jeff sort of blew up at her. He said he was really hungry right now, and there was basically no food in the house, and so he couldn't even eat anything else to tide himself over, like, come on, let me eat. Now, Jeff's reaction made Linda pretty mad, but at the same time, it didn't really surprise her. I mean, Jeff had been talking back to her a lot lately, and the two of them seemed to fight all the time. Linda knew he was sort of just being a typical teenager, and he was really hungry, and so he's testing her limits. But she was just getting really sick of it. And so before she could even really think about it, she snapped back at him and said, well, if you don't like it here, you can leave. And at that, Jeff literally stormed out of the house and slammed the door behind him. Linda went to the window and watched her son pick up his bike and pedal off down the road. After that, Linda sighed and walked over to her phone and called her mom. She assumed, Jeff, her son, would go to her parents' house since they lived nearby. And when Linda's mother picked up, Linda warned her that Jeff might be there soon and he'd likely want to eat. Her mom said that was fine, and they would drop him back off after dinner. Then, her mom said she actually was glad that Linda called, because another letter came. And as soon as Linda heard that, she felt this wave of anxiety come over her, because she knew what kind of letter she was talking about. So, Linda's ex-husband and Tim and Jeff's dad, Frank Slayton, lived back in Alabama. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic, and they'd been divorced for 7 years. But Frank had never stopped harassing Linda after they broke up. And since Linda and the boys had moved to Lakeland, he had been mailing threatening letters to Linda's parents, saying that Linda had ruined his life. And so now Linda was thinking, no matter how many fresh starts she started, that Frank was always going to screw them up. He was never going to go away. And so after taking a calming breath, Linda told her mom on the phone to just rip the letter up. She didn't even want to read it. Not long after she hung up, her younger son, Tim, came in the front door. He was all sweaty and dirty from football practice, and right away, Linda asked him, hey, did you thank your coach for giving you a ride home? And Tim said, yes, I did. So Linda, she didn't have a car because she couldn't afford one. And so Tim's coach always had to give him a ride, but Tim said, I thanked him like always. And so Linda told him to hurry up and eat because they had to go next door to the neighbor's party. Hours later, after 11 p.m. that evening, Linda and Tim walked home from the party through the dark apartment complex. There were 7 other people who had been at the party, and it had been a lot of fun. Everybody just drank iced tea and played cards while they talked about the perks of living in this great new complex, like the great business district across the street and how responsive the maintenance team was. So Linda was glad they went. She was also exhausted, and her sister always came over for coffee in the morning, so she needed to go to bed now or she would never wake up. However, when she and Tim got back to their unit and opened up the door, Linda froze because there was already somebody inside. For a second, she thought it might be an intruder, but then she realized it was actually just her older son, Jeff, who had come back. He was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a sort of "I'm sorry" expression on his face. Tim saw the situation and immediately disappeared into the second bedroom to give his mother and brother some space. Linda went to join Jeff in the kitchen, but Jeff didn't say anything. So Linda spoke first and reminded him that it was not good to go to bed angry. However, Jeff still didn't say anything. And Linda knew from experience with her son, it was better not to force Jeff to talk. So she decided she would just give Jeff a minute, and she began washing the dishes. Finally, after a few moments, Jeff mumbled that he loved his mom, and Linda smiled. She felt relieved they could just move on from this. She said it was all good and that she loved him too. Then they both said goodnight, and Jeff went over to the cot in the living room where he slept, and then Linda wrapped up in the kitchen, turned off the lights, and headed into her own bedroom, closed the door, and she went to bed too. The next morning at 8:30 a.m., Linda's sister, Judy Butler, walked up to Linda's duplex. They'd had coffee together every morning since they moved to the neighborhood, so Judy expected to knock on her sister's door and go right in like she always did. But this time after she knocked, nobody answered. So Judy waited and then knocked again. And when there was still no response, Judy reached down and tried to open up the door, but she found it was locked. This had never happened before. Linda always answered the door, or at least called out in response. But Judy wasn't really worried. She just assumed, that Linda must have overslept or something. So Judy decided she would just go home for now and let her sister have a few minutes, and eventually she would call to check in on her and make sure she was okay. However, as she walked away from the home, she noticed something strange on the side of Linda's house. One of the back windows was missing a screen, and Judy knew that that particular room was Linda's bedroom, and it hadn't been like that yesterday. So seeing it now made her feel kind of uneasy, and so she went over to look inside. And when she looked inside, she saw her sister fast asleep in bed. And for a second, Judy was relieved, because this confirmed that this is all this was. Her sister had overslept, that's that. But then Judy realized there was something off about Linda, like the way she was positioned just seemed wrong. And when everything clicked for her, she staggered backwards and began to scream. By 9 a.m. on September 4th, 1981, a crowd of reporters and police officers surrounded the duplex in a Lakeland, Florida housing complex where a woman had reported seeing a dead body. In the middle of all the activity, Sergeant Edgar Pickett of the Lakeland Police ducked under some crime scene tape and headed to the home's walkway with a bag of equipment slung over his shoulder. So Pickett was actually just a year away from retirement after 2 decades as a detective, and for the last few years, he'd been the head of Lakeland's crime scene unit, which meant he oversaw the collection and documentation of evidence at crime scenes. And so he wasn't the lead investigator on this case, but when it came to forensic analysis and fingerprint collection, he was the best they had. He'd already been briefed on the situation and knew that this was very likely a homicide, and the victim had been identified as 31-year-old Linda Slayton. Linda had been found in her bedroom by her sister, who had asked a nearby maintenance worker to call 911. Pickett also knew that when the first responder got inside the house, they found that Linda's 2 kids were still asleep and appeared to have no idea their mother was deceased in the next room, which Pickett knew would give investigators somewhat of a timeline to start with. Linda was clearly awake when her kids went to sleep and must have died sometime during the night while her kids were still sleeping. As Pickett walked up the walkway, he passed by 2 teenage boys sitting in their pajamas on the ground. He assumed these must be the sons, and one of them just sort of stared ahead, seemingly in complete shock, while the other sort of sobbed into his brother's shoulder. Pickett wasn't sure if anybody had spoken to them yet, but he knew they would likely be really helpful in focusing his search for evidence. Since they lived in the house, they'd know the habits and patterns of everybody who lived there and might be able to tell him if anything seemed out of place. So Pickett made a mental note to make sure to check in with the investigators inside about that. Then he looked at the house and took a deep breath. Pickett liked to get a sort of first impression of the crime scene before he did any actual collections. So before he would go in, he would walk around the entire house and sort of assess the building. He had been told that all the doors were locked when the police first got there. And from what he could see, the bedroom window with the missing screen was the only sign of a potential break-in. So he took out his kit and spent some time dusting around that window area for prints. But he didn't find much there, or any noticeable shoe impressions in the dirt outside. And then when he finally headed inside, Pickett quickly moved past all the officers and detectives that were already in there and went straight to the bedroom. And the first thing he saw when he got inside was Linda's body on the bed with a metal coat hanger wrapped around her throat. The sheets around her were covered in blood, and she was shirtless, and the bottom of her dress was pulled up. And when Pickett got closer, he saw where the blood had come from. There were long, very deep scratches on Linda's neck, which he guessed were from her nails as she tried to pry the hanger away. He'd have to wait for the autopsy, but it was clear from her wounds that the hanger had been used to strangle her. And considering she was partially naked and the positioning of her clothes, he guessed she had also been likely sexually assaulted. Pickett stepped back and looked around the room, trying to decide where to start. He needed to find as much forensic evidence in this room as possible, so the first thing he did was try and guess what happened and how the killer might have interacted with the crime scene. That way, he could follow their sort of imagined path with more intention. He figured the killer must have come in through the open window, since that was the only entrance into the house that was obviously tampered with. Linda's purse and jewelry were still on the dresser, and the drawers were all closed as opposed to open and rifled through, so it didn't seem like the killer had touched any of that stuff, which also meant this likely was not a robbery gone wrong. In fact, it seemed like the first and only thing the killer had done was come in through the window and attack Linda. Because aside from the bloody bed, Pickett didn't see any signs of a struggle. So Linda was likely caught off guard by a very fast attack and unable to really fight back quickly. Because if she did, the room would be a huge mess. But then Pickett caught a glimpse of Linda's closet, and he noticed the clothes were all hanging on metal hangers that looked identical to the one that was around Linda's neck. And that's when it hit him. The killer must have at some point been in the closet, hiding. He supposed the killer could have broken in first and then grabbed a hanger once the attack started, but that would have taken too much time and also given Linda a chance to get off the bed or fight back or yell out and maybe wake her sons up. It was much more likely that the killer had broken in earlier, hid in the closet, and then waited until Linda was in her bed asleep to come out and attack. If Pickett was right about that, this became definitely a premeditated, thought-out murder, which meant the killer must have either known Linda personally or had been watching her, since they would have known when to sneak into the room and not be detected. At this point, Pickett took out his gear and began thinking how he was going to begin looking for evidence. He figured he would start at the window and spend some time there, and then he would go to the closet. Those would be his two primary areas. And so once he had that plan in mind, he went to the window and he began looking for evidence, and sure enough, after only a few minutes of dusting, he smiled. Because there, on the ledge, was a very clear, well-defined handprint. The following afternoon, over 24 hours after Linda's body had been found, Pickett sat in the precinct's fingerprint lab, comparing two sets of prints with a magnifying glass. He'd been at it for hours already, so his head was pounding. After processing the crime scene yesterday, Pickett had gone back to the station to review the evidence he'd collected. And while he was there, he decided he would go check in with the detectives to get an update on the case. And what they would tell him is they had spoken to the neighbors, as well as Linda's family, and they did have a few solid leads and a timeline. According to Linda's kids, the older son Jeff got dropped off at home at about 9:30 p.m. after being with his grandparents. And Tim, the younger son, and Linda had gotten back from a neighbor's party just after 11 p.m. They all went to bed around midnight, and neither of the brothers heard anything until the police woke them up the next morning. And all of this had led the investigators to agree with Pickett's initial interpretation of the scene, that Linda's attack was very fast. It seemed like she had not been able to even scream, or it would have woken up her sons. The autopsy report had also come in, and it confirmed Linda died from strangulation and was sexually assaulted. The medical examiner had also been able to collect semen from Linda's body, which meant they were definitely looking for a man here. And since this was now clearly a sexually motivated crime, it meant that anybody Linda had been romantically involved with was now suddenly a top suspect. After speaking with Linda's family, the detectives discovered that Linda had two serious ex-partners. She had her ex-husband, Frank Slayton, and an ex-boyfriend named Brendan Fowler. Frank apparently had abused Linda when they were married and still sent her very threatening letters. And Brendan was apparently very possessive with a bad temper, and Linda had broken up with him just 2 days before her murder. And so some officers were already out looking for both of these men, and Pickett was eager to get both of their prints. But for now, Pickett was actually more focused on Linda's neighbors. When the detectives had done their canvass initially, the neighbors they spoke to had confirmed that Linda and her younger son Tim were indeed at that party. And since these neighbors were some of the last people to see Linda alive, they weren't just witnesses, they were suspects. And so Pickett had collected fingerprints from all the men at that party who didn't have an alibi for the period of time after Linda went home. And that's what he was working on now, comparing those prints to the print he had found on the windowsill. So far, none were a match, but they had also gotten blood samples from the neighbors, and so Pickett would have to test those as well. So in 1981, DNA testing didn't exist yet, but investigators could figure out somebody's blood type through bodily fluids. So Pickett and his team could test those samples against the genetic material found on Linda's body and rule out suspects that way. But Pickett had another reason for wanting to be diligent when it came to testing the people who lived in the complex. It was because after Linda's murder, like in the last 24 hours, there had been signs that the killer might actually still be in the area. At 3 a.m. that morning, one of Linda's neighbors had called in to say a stranger had broken into her house. And even though that person was gone by the time the police arrived, they could see her back door had clearly been forced open. And then another neighbor had called in to say that the screen on their window was pried open as well. None of them were violent assaults like Linda's, but the timing was very suspicious. And it made Pickett wonder if there was a serial predator living in the complex. The department had ordered some patrols in the area, and Pickett was supposed to get fingerprints for whoever they got calls about. So he was working with his radio right next to him. Pickett leaned back in his chair to give his eyes a rest. He knew he was getting pretty tired and would need a break soon. But just seconds later, a detective barged into the lab and told Pickett they needed him on standby for fingerprinting because they just brought Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, in for questioning. Moments later, Pickett was standing outside of an interrogation room, listening as some detectives spoke with Brendan Fowler inside. Even though he couldn't see Brendan, Pickett could tell by his voice that he was not happy to be here. He sounded argumentative and defensive as he insisted he really had nothing to do with Linda's death. And when he was asked about where he was the night she died, he had an alibi. He said he was at home with his family, and he stayed there the whole night. He even gave detectives his mom's phone number and said they should call her to confirm it. Pickett heard the detectives confer in hushed voices. Then they asked Brendan if he'd be willing to take a polygraph test and let them take his fingerprints. And to Pickett's surprise, Brendan said, yeah, go ahead. And as soon as Pickett heard that, based on experience, he went right inside the room and got Brendan's fingerprints before Brendan could change his mind. On September 11th, so 1 week after Linda's murder, Pickett sat down at his desk and opened the newspaper, and what he saw made him cringe. The Lakeland police chief had just given an interview where he admitted they would not be making an arrest now or in the next few days. And reading that in print reminded Pickett of just how little they had in this case. None of the neighbors' prints had been a match to the one Pickett had lifted off the windowsill, and they'd tracked down Linda's ex-husband, Frank, but found that he was in Alabama on the night Linda was killed. As for Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, he had seemed pretty guilty at first because during his polygraph, the results had been inconclusive, and his alibi didn't check out. His family had said he was home at one point on the night Linda was killed, but they all went to sleep and couldn't say for sure if maybe he left or not. But when Pickett had looked at his prints, he had no choice but to clear him, because they clearly were not a match. So now Pickett knew the entire investigative team was scrambling for leads. which was why Pickett was not surprised by what he saw when he looked up from his paper. He saw a detective leading a suspect out of a precinct interrogation room after clearly questioning him, and it was Linda's own 15-year-old son, Jeff Slayton, and he was obviously crying. Pickett had heard that Jeff was being looked into as a suspect in his mother's murder and had already been questioned a few times. Detectives had started getting interested in him when a few of Linda's family members mentioned that, Jeff and Linda had been fighting a lot before she died. And when investigators looked back at the crime scene photos, they realized Jeff's cot in the living room shared a wall with Linda's room. So it was strange he hadn't heard anything on the night she had died. But as far as Pickett knew, Jeff had a reasonable explanation for all of this. He had said that he and his mother's fights were not that serious, and they did fight the night she died, but it was over some dumb argument over what time dinner was. And he said he had no idea why he didn't wake up when she was attacked, because he wished he had so he could have gone in there and helped her. And also Jeff had taken and passed a polygraph test. But for some reason, it seemed like the investigative team was not done with Jeff. And Pickett just sort of felt bad for the kid, because he thought it was very unlikely at this point that Jeff was his own mother's killer. Pickett had kids of his own, and from his own experience, the fights Jeff was having with his mom just seemed sort of like typical teenage behavior, squabbling with their parents. It's pretty normal. And it also just didn't line up with the evidence. Pickett was absolutely certain that the attacker broke in through the window, which didn't make sense for Jeff if he was sleeping right next door in the living room. And Pickett had personally checked Jeff's prints against the one he lifted from the window, and he knew it was not a match. As the days turned into weeks, Pickett was starting to become convinced that the killer might be somebody without a personal connection to Linda. Maybe it was even a stranger. He knew that murders by strangers were much more rare than murders committed by a relative, partner, or friend, which was why he assumed the detectives weren't pursuing it. But through his forensics, Pickett had now eliminated pretty much everybody in Linda's life who had a motive or opportunity to kill her. And Linda was a very attractive young woman who was very outgoing. Pickett thought it was possible the killer could be a stranger who had only interacted with her once and then sort of became fixated on her. It seemed possible. And so after Pickett watched Jeff leave, he tried to go back to the newspaper, but he kept thinking about Linda. He'd been sure this case would be solved quickly by forensics, but now he wasn't sure if it would be solved at all. And that worry only got stronger and stronger as the months went by and fewer leads came in. And before long, a whole year had passed, and it was actually time for Pickett to retire. And when he left the precinct for the last time, he sort of had a pit in his stomach, because he had a feeling that without him, Linda's case was going to get put on a shelf and forgotten. One afternoon in the fall of 2001, so 2 decades after Linda Slayton was murdered, Detective Brad Grice sat in his office at the Lakeland Police Department reading over Linda's cold case file. For the last 4 years, Grice had been sorting through the department's cold cases and choosing which ones to reopen. And this had been a really slow process, because he had to do that and juggle his active caseload. So even though he'd technically been working on Linda's case for years, he was just now starting to really dig into it. But the delay didn't worry him too much, since the whole reason this case appealed to him was because he was sure he could solve it quickly. Because it had DNA evidence. So back in 1981, when the murder actually happened, the genetic material that was found on Linda's body was only good for eliminating suspects through blood type. But now, in 2001, Bryce could use that same material to create a full DNA profile of Linda's killer. And he intended on reaching out to everybody involved in the original investigation to get their DNA to test against this new profile. But before he did this, he wanted to familiarize himself with the suspects from 1981. So there was Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton, who had abused Linda repeatedly during their marriage. And even though they had been divorced for years, he was apparently still sending her all these threatening letters around the time of her murder. And then her more recent romantic partner, Brendan Fowler, was known to have a bad temper and seemed very controlling of Linda. And they broke up only 2 days before her murder, so he could have still been furious about it. The neighbors at the party Linda had gone to were also suspects. Everybody in that group knew when Linda was heading home, so somebody could have maybe followed her and then snuck into her bedroom before she went to bed. And then finally, Jeff Slayton, Linda's oldest son, was actually in the house during the murder. His brother Tim had been too, but Jeff actually admitted to getting in a big fight with Linda earlier that same day. Now, all of these suspects had been cleared through fingerprints, alibi, or polygraphs. But Grice knew that DNA testing was way more accurate than any of those methods of elimination. And so basically, even if they'd been ruled out for one of those three things, DNA overrode that. And so he wasn't going to let these previous eliminations cloud his judgment. He'd already decided that, basically no matter what, he was just going to focus on whatever the forensics told him and not be biased. But for now, he just wanted to kick things off by speaking with the two people who'd known Linda better than anybody else. Her sons, Tim and Jeff. A few days later, Grice walked into a meeting room at the precinct, where he'd been told Jeff and Tim Slayton were waiting. And as soon as he saw the brothers, he just started laughing, because he realized he knew Jeff Slayton. They had bowled together for years, but it hadn't occurred to Grice that this Jeff was that Jeff. And Jeff recognized Grice at the same time. So they spent a while talking and laughing about what a crazy coincidence this was. And so when Grice finally sat down with Jeff and with Tim at the same time, Grice's first line of questioning was actually just pretty emotional. It just was like, hey, how are you guys holding up after this horrible thing? And for the next few minutes, the mood got pretty heavy as the two brothers spoke honestly about how terrible the last 20 years had been. After their mother had been killed, they both said they were terrified that, they were going to get hurt too, because the killer was never caught. They felt like, who's next? Jeff said he slept with a knife under his pillow, and he eventually got so depressed, he dropped out of high school. And Tim admitted he also struggled, but he took a different path. He relied on his football team and friends for support and kept pictures of all of them around his room to remind himself to stay positive. After that, the brothers shared what they could remember about the night their mother had died. But it was obvious to Grice that, Tim and Jeff didn't really have any information he didn't already have inside the case file. So instead of continuing to question them about details of the case, Grice explained that this murder was going to be solved through DNA. And because of that, he needed to collect samples from every person involved in this case, which included both of them. The brothers looked surprised for a moment, but then said, of course. So Grice stood up and said he would send a tech inside. But before he left, he promised them that he would find their mom's killer, and he was not going to retire until he did. Later that month, Grice sat in front of a screen in the station's computer lab, reading a police report from 1982. Since speaking to the two Slayton brothers, Grice had collected DNA from dozens of people who were involved in the case from 1981. Jeff, Tim, and also Linda's ex-husband Frank Slayton and her ex-boyfriend Brendan Fowler. He'd also tested the blood samples that the original investigators got from Linda's neighbors, but none of them matched the DNA profile for Linda's killer, which was disappointing because it meant that Grice had to basically start from scratch. But when he had gone back to the case notes, he noticed the mention of break-ins around the complex shortly after Linda's murder, and it made him wonder if Linda was killed by a serial predator who was in the area at the time. And if that was true, then this person would not have just hurt Linda, they would have other victims too. So Grice had run the killer's DNA through the FBI's database. And when it didn't match anything in there, he had reached out to the county sheriff's department to see if they could send him any cases that, felt similar to Linda's. And they had sent over the report that he was reading right now. And it felt incredibly promising. So in 1982, a year after Linda's murder, a man named Jimmy Ulmer was arrested for climbing through a 10-year-old girl's bedroom window, then assaulting and strangling her. And according to his file, Jimmy had this long history of home invasions and very violent behavior. And as soon as Grice finished reading the report, he jumped up and went to go find one of his officers. He wanted to dig up as much information on Jimmy as he possibly could and see if maybe they could go track him down. About a month later, Grice sat at his desk staring at his phone in anxious anticipation. He was waiting for an incredibly important call, one that would confirm whether Jimmy Ulmer was Linda's killer. After doing a background check on Jimmy, Grice had found out that Jimmy actually knew someone who lived at Linda's complex and was literally staying with them when Linda was killed. Now, Jimmy was not alive anymore, but they had gotten in touch with his mother, who gave them her DNA, which they were testing now. So this DNA would not be an exact match to the killer's DNA, but it would show if she was at least a relative to the killer. And as Grice waited for the lab to call, his heart was pounding. Because for the first time since he'd picked up Linda's case, everything finally made sense now. Jimmy was this violent serial home invader who had probably seen Linda while staying at his friend's house and maybe stalked her until he saw an opportunity to attack. And then after he killed her, he must have compulsively kept breaking into other homes to find more victims. Just then the phone rang and Grice picked it up, and he could feel his mouth going dry as he heard it was the lab on the other side. He was going to get an answer here. But just a second later, they told him it was not a match. Grice's stomach dropped, but he thanked them anyway, and he hung up. He couldn't believe it. Despite all the suspects and forensic evidence that they had, this case was once again at a dead end. Still, Grice kept pushing forward. As the months passed by, he would regularly find new suspects and eventually clear them. He also kept sending the killer's DNA profile to the FBI to run it through their database in case any new additions were, added in that could be a match. But eventually, over a decade passed by, and Grice still had not been able to match anybody to the killer's DNA. And in 2015, his own health began to decline, and he finally had to make the call he hoped he would never have to make. He picked up the phone and dialed Jeff Slayton's number. And when Jeff picked up, Grice said he did need to retire, and he still had not found his mother's killer. In June of 2019, 4 years into retirement, Grice sat on the deck of his Florida home reading a newspaper. He was deep in an article when his cell phone rang. And when he looked at the ID, he was surprised to see it was from the Lakeland Police Department. He had not gotten a call from them in years, so he immediately picked it up to see what they wanted. And when he did, the person on the other end introduced himself as the detective who had taken over the Linda Slayton case. The detective said they knew Grice was retired now, but they figured he would want to hear this. They said they had hired a genetic genealogist to track down family members of the killer based on the DNA profile that Grice had ordered. And through that process, they had finally been able to get a match. And after they did, they also managed to get the suspect's fingerprints. And those prints did match the palm print that the head of the crime scene unit, Sergeant Edgar Pickett, had taken at the original crime scene 38 years earlier. Grice sat up and listened intently as the detective finally told him who Linda's killer actually was. And when he heard the name, he couldn't believe it. That suspect had been so close the whole time. Based on DNA, forensic evidence, and 38 years of police investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Linda Slayton in the early morning hours of September 4th, 1981. The house was all quiet as the killer waited patiently inside of Linda's closet. Hours earlier, when Linda was out, the killer had removed that screen from her bedroom window and crept inside, and then they had hid in this closet until she had come home. The killer had been watching Linda for a while now and finding ways to get close to her and her family, but Linda never really acknowledged them or paid any attention to them at all. Tonight, though, the killer was determined to show Linda that she was not the one in control. They were. And now, the killer stood in the dark closet holding their breath as their heart pounded and as they listened to Linda open her bedroom door and walk inside. And the killer continued to wait anxiously as they listened to the sound of Linda getting ready for bed and getting changed, and then eventually they heard the sound of the springs of the bed compressing as Linda laid down to shut her eyes for the night. And then after the killer was sure Linda was in bed, the lights are off, it's quiet in the room, they waited even longer just to make sure Linda was asleep and her children were asleep. And then finally, when the killer felt like they had waited long enough, they grabbed a coat hanger off the hook in the closet and then burst out of the door. And then before Linda could do anything, make a sound, even react, she's totally caught off guard, the killer was on top of her and had wrapped the coat hanger around her throat. Linda struggled and clawed at her throat to try to get this thing off of her, but the killer was so much stronger than her, and there was nothing she could do. It didn't take long for the killer to have their way with Linda, and then after they were done, they strangled her until she was dead. And once the killer was done, they hopped off the bed and just climbed right back out the same window they had come in through and wandered off into the night. And the killer would get to replay this crime over and over in their head all day the next day until it was time for football practice. It would turn out Linda was murdered by her son's football coach, Joseph Mills. Joseph was a fixture in Tim's life and would drive him to and from practice every day because Linda didn't have a car. But while Tim saw Joseph as a mentor in his life, Joseph had apparently just developed a total fixation on his mother. And during all those trips to her house to drop off her son, Joseph was planning out how and when to attack her. Back in 1981, Joseph was interviewed by police over the phone a day after Linda's murder, but he was never really considered an actual suspect. Instead, after Joseph murdered Linda, he just continued to drive her son Tim to and from football practice, and Tim would even very tragically begin to rely on Joseph for, emotional support, grieving the loss of his mother. But it's to her killer. He just didn't know. And then even more tragically, as time went on and Linda's case went cold, one of the pictures that Tim hung in his bedroom to remind himself to stay positive was of his football team. Tim had no idea that his mother's killer was literally standing right behind him in the back row in that picture. In December of 2019, Joseph was charged with first-degree murder and sexual battery and was eventually sentenced to life in prison without parole. In 1985, 36-year-old Michael Reamer was a roofer in Tacoma, Washington, and his boss described him as being a work hard, play hard type of guy. In the winter months, when there really wasn't any roofing to be done, Mike would supplement his income by trapping coyote, mink, and muskrat in the forest that butted up against the Nisqually River, which was an 80-mile stretch that ran right near his home. Most of the traps Mike would set would be far away from any actual trail, because wherever there was a trail, you would have human foot traffic, and that would scare away the animals that you're trying to catch in your trap. And so as a result, he would place his traps in very remote, isolated sections of the forest, which meant he needed to know where those sections were. And so over the 15 years he spent trapping in this forest, he got really, really good at navigating it. It was like he had a map in his head of where everything was in this forest. Plus, Mike was already an avid outdoorsman, and so navigating a forest and being out in the wild was something that just kind of came naturally to him. Mike's girlfriend was a 21-year-old woman named Diana Robertson, and they had a 2-year-old daughter named Crystal. Mike and Diana had a rocky relationship, to say the least. In fact, in October of that year, Diana had filed a restraining order against Mike after he had kicked in the door and thrown her to the ground. Mike also always carried a gun on him, and he had a very quick temper. But despite their significant relationship issues, the one thing they could always see eye to eye on was their daughter, Crystal. They adored her, and when it came to decisions about her, they were always on the same page. It was whatever is in the best interest of Crystal. In December of that year, Diana and Mike were able to reconcile, and so Diana threw the restraining order out. And in fact, she and Crystal moved back in with Mike, which made Crystal very, very happy. Just a couple of days after moving back in, they decided they wanted to go out and go camping together as a family, and then also pick out a real Christmas tree they could bring back for the holidays. And so they settled on an area that was going to be in the same forest where Mike had all of his traps set, and they figured they could, get their family time in, they could get their Christmas tree, and Mike would be able to check his traps, saving himself from making another trip later on. So on December 12th, the three of them loaded up into Mike's red pickup truck, and they drove the 30 minutes down towards Nisqually River, where there was this logging road that Mike would use to park his truck and then walk in to check his traps. So Mike pulls over on the side of the road, they all hop out, and Mike leads the way right into the middle of the woods. There's no trail. Mike is just bringing them to an area where, one, his traps will be, and two, he thinks is suitable for camping and for looking for a Christmas tree. Later that afternoon, Crystal was spotted walking around a parking lot of a Kmart 20 miles away from where Mike had parked the car near Nisqually River. And she's just walking around, she looks totally confused, she's all alone, and the employees of the Kmart are looking out, and they see this girl, and they're all watching, waiting for, her parents or a guardian or someone to walk over and show that they are with this girl. But after a couple of minutes, when no one does that, one of the employees goes out and tries to talk to her. And this employee would say when she talked to the girl, she kept looking over her shoulder and she was just terrified the whole time. And so this employee asked her, what's your name? And she didn't say anything. She asked her, where are you coming from? Where are your parents? Who's looking after you? And to all the questions she was asked, she didn't say anything. She just looked terrified and was looking over her shoulder. And so this employee brings the girl back inside and they call the police. And so the police show up and they ask the girl the same questions that the employees have been asking her, and the girl's still not speaking. And so after they made an announcement inside to say, hey, is anybody in here the parent or guardian of this child? And no one came forward. They said, okay, well, we have no other choice, but we're gonna have to move her to temporary foster care. And so they move her to a foster home, and then they put an ad out in the newspaper that day with a picture of her, basically saying, if you know me, contact this number. 2 days later, Crystal's maternal grandmother would see the picture in the newspaper, and the ad did not have a description of, how she was discovered. It just said she had been found at this particular Kmart, and if you know who she is, please contact this number. Even without the details, the grandmother knows something has gone wrong, because there's no reason in the world those two parents would abandon their beloved Crystal. And so she calls Diana, she calls Mike, they don't pick up the phone. That's when she calls the number and she says, what's going on? I'm her grandmother, where is she? The police tell her to go to the foster home and they will meet her there and they're gonna talk about what happened. So the grandmother flies to the foster home and she arrives there before the police. She goes inside and Crystal is so happy to see her. It's the first time Crystal has really broken out of that kind of catatonic state she had been in ever since she was found at the Kmart. And so she runs up to her grandmother, they have this reunion, and the grandmother's so happy to see Crystal, but she's also thinking, where are your parents? Where are Diana and Mike? And so she asks Crystal, where are they, honey? Where is your mom? Where's your dad? And Crystal would speak to her grandmother and she would say, Mommy's in the trees. Her grandmother didn't know what this meant, and so she tried to ask clarifying questions, but Crystal was not very verbal. She was not able to articulate more than what she was saying, so she just kept repeating it, saying, Mommy's in the trees, Mommy's in the trees. And so then the police show up and the grandmother turns to them and she says, where are her parents? Where are Mike and Diana? And the police turn to her and they're like, we don't know. We found her abandoned in this parking lot and she wasn't speaking and no one knew anything about her. And so until right now, we didn't even know her parents' names. Do you have any idea where they might be? And the grandmother's like, I have no idea. I mean, I'm just learning about all of this stuff now. But when I came over here, Crystal said to me, Mommy's in the trees. And she's not very verbal, so she can't explain much more than that. But she just kept saying, Mommy's in the trees. And I know Mike liked to go camping in this one area near the Nisqually River. He keeps traps out near the edge of the water. He catches some small animals out there. So I know he goes out there and goes camping. And so maybe that's what Crystal's referencing, that they were in the trees. So they were in that forest over there. The grandmother also gave the police the address to Mike's house, and the police use that information to launch their search for the parents. And so the first place they go is Mike's house, and all the lights are off, the door is locked, and his red pickup truck, because the grandmother said he drove a red pickup truck, his red pickup truck is not there. And so they rule out his house, they're not there, and they begin flying a plane not only over Tacoma, which is the area where they were living, but also over that forest that was right up against the Nisqually River. And as they're flying, they're looking for campsites that could potentially be Mike and Diana, but they're also looking for the red pickup truck, which is fairly distinctive. And after a couple of days of flying all over the forest and looking around the side streets and putting people in the forest walking on foot, they couldn't find anything and they turned the search off. And they would tell the grandmother and the rest of the family on Diana's and Mike's side that they really just needed to wait for more information to come in, because they couldn't just spend an indefinite amount of time scanning a fairly large area. They have all of Tacoma and this huge forest. And so everyone just had to wait. 2 months later, a man and his dog were out walking on this logging road that was about 10 miles away from the Nisqually River and 30 miles away from the Kmart where Crystal was found. And they're walking on this road and they see way off in the distance, there's this truck that's pulled over to the side of this road. And even from a distance, they can tell it's covered in snow. But it hasn't snowed recently. There's snow on the ground, but the amount of snow that is on this truck indicates it's been sitting here for quite a while. And so as they get closer to the truck, this man is looking around, seeing if maybe the owner is nearby, even though it seemed unlikely given the fact that it looks like it's been sitting here a while. And so after he stands there for a minute looking around, feeling pretty confident there's no one in the area, he brushes the snow off the passenger side window and he looks inside, and he doesn't see anything at first, but he notices on the passenger front seat there's a significant amount of blood on the seat, or what appears to be blood. And this startles the guy, so he backs up from it, and he and his dog very quickly leave this area because they're in this kind of desolate, logging road. He's pretty isolated, and so he gets out of there as quickly as he can, and when he gets to a phone, he calls the police. Police show up and they brush the rest of the snow off, and they find it is a red pickup truck. It's Mike's red pickup truck. Mike and Diana's case had been very big news in the area when it happened, and the news had really not gone away. People were out there looking for this couple. And so as soon as they saw this was Mike's truck, they start fanning out and searching the area, seeing if they can find any other clues about what happened to Mike and Diana. And very quickly, they discovered Diana's body. She was located not far from the red truck, just barely off the road in the forest. She was under several inches of snow, and she had been stabbed 17 times, and there was a tube sock wrapped around her neck. There was no sign of Mike, but once they got inside the truck, there was a manila folder that had been tucked up on the dashboard that just said, "I love you, Diana." When police showed that message to Diana's family, they all said, "That looks like Mike's handwriting. He used to send us handwritten Christmas cards, and that looks exactly the way he writes." As for the blood that was on the passenger seat inside the truck, it had been sitting out for too long, so they weren't able to determine whose blood it was, but they were able to determine it was human. So between the blood on the front seat, the note that was left on the dashboard, the personal furious nature of the way in which Diana was killed, combined with Mike's history of violence and his disappearance, because he's not here anymore, that all made it seem an awful lot like Mike was the guy that did this. In fact, this made for a very tidy ending to a mystery that had actually started before Diana had been killed. On August 10th, 1985, so 4 months before Mike, Diana, and Crystal ventured off into the woods near Nisqually River, 27-year-old Stephen Harkins and his girlfriend, 42-year-old Ruth Cooper, were going camping near Nisqually River in the same forest. They were actually about 15 miles from where Diana's body was ultimately found, and they were very close to a number of Mike's traps, although they probably didn't realize they were near them. During their trip, an unknown assailant walked up to their campsite in the middle of the night and shot them both to death. Stephen was found right away, and he was found inside of his sleeping bag at their campsite, indicating he had been killed in his sleep. Ruth wasn't found for months, and when she was found 1.5 miles away from the campsite, and she had a tube sock tied around her neck the same way Diana had, and the knot that was used on the tube sock was even the same as the knot used on Diana's tube sock. So the similarity was just too much to overlook, and so to the police, they're thinking Mike has to be the guy in both of these cases. He attacked Ruth and Stephen, perhaps because they were, on his territory where his traps were, and he didn't like that. He has a history of violence, and so he attacks them. And then a couple months later, he attacks Diana, and then he flees. As for his daughter being found alive at the Kmart, it would seem he just did not have it in him to harm his own child, and so he dropped her off at the Kmart before he ultimately fled. Despite everything seeming to fit just perfectly to where, yep, Mike is definitely the guy, not only for Diana, but for Ruth and for Stephen, we figured it out. Despite that being the overwhelming feeling, there were a couple of questions that remained unanswered. Like the FBI, they were unable to confirm the handwriting on that folder that said, "I love you, Diana." They were unable to confirm that that in fact was Mike's handwriting. Diana's family was really convinced it was his, but the FBI said it's not necessarily a match. And then you have the motives for the two crimes. We can understand one of them. Him attacking Diana, unfortunately, people attack their partners all the time, and so we can understand that. We can rationalize that. But for him to attack Ruth and Stephen, two total strangers, because what? They encroached on your land, even though it's not your land, it's public land, and you just happen to put your traps out there? That didn't seem like a strong enough reason for him to want to kill them. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelmingly pointing at Mike being the guy. You have the fact that he's this violent guy with a history of domestic abuse. He knows this area well where both crimes were committed. You have the tube sock tied around Diana the same way it's tied around Ruth. It just had to be Mike. And so because the police felt so strongly it had to be Mike, they were willing to overlook these lingering questions. And so the police wanted to issue an arrest warrant for Mike, but they needed to be able to prove he was alive, because if he was dead, then that calls into question his ability to have committed these two crimes. And so they didn't have proof he was alive. And so very quickly, this story faded out of the headlines because basically everybody believed Mike had done it and he had run off somewhere, and maybe someday we'll figure out where he went and we'll bring him to justice. But until then, we know he's the guy. For years, no one heard from Mike, no one saw Mike. It was like he had just totally vanished. Crystal was raised by relatives, and many of the detectives that were working on these cases eventually retired or moved on. Then, 25 years later, in March of 2011, a hiker was walking through the forest near the Nisqually River, about 1 mile from where Diana's body was found, and they would stumble upon a piece of a human skull. She calls the police show up, they search the area, and they discover another bone, a human jawbone. And it would turn out it was Mike's. The rest of Mike's remains were never found, and because there was so little of him to work with, police were not able to determine a cause of death. However, they were able to date his death back to almost exactly the same time frame that Diana had died. Additionally, investigators believe the reason they did not find more of Mike's remains is because he had been buried. The two bones that were found, the skull and the jawbone, they were located within 1 mile of where Diana's body had been found, and that area, after Diana had been found, had been scoured. They looked everywhere for clues, and because he apparently died at the same time she did, he would have been out there and they would have found him. So the fact that they didn't find him can only mean he was underground. So this all meant Mike could not have been the killer. Because in order for him to have been the killer, he not only would have had to attack Diana and then drive his daughter to the Kmart and then drive back to the forest, he would then need to take his own life and then also somehow bury himself. Some of the police officers that had worked that case were still on the police force, and so when they heard this news about Mike not being the killer, they were like, it never really made any sense that he would attack Ruth or Steven, unless he was a serial killer. And then it clicked. They probably were dealing with a serial killer. It just wasn't Mike. And their only eyewitness was the toddler, Crystal, who apparently the serial killer could not bring themselves to harm. And so as a result, Crystal just sat there and watched these horrible things happen to her parents, and then probably spent a fair amount of time with the serial killer afterwards because they needed to drive her to the Kmart. Investigators and her family had tried to get her to give more information about what she had witnessed, but all she could say was, "Mommy's in the trees." And so there are really only two interpretations of what that means. Either one, she was just stating that her mother was in the forest, and that would have been accurate, or she's remembering her mother trying to escape a serial killer by climbing up into a tree. Or maybe even that she was in the tree with her mother as they both were trying to escape a serial killer with a knife. So when the police have this revelation that Mike was not the killer, that in fact, it was probably a serial killer, and we know nothing about this serial killer besides what Crystal had to say as a toddler, and that didn't provide any sort of real clarity on who this person was or what their MO was. They went back and looked at all the unsolved murders in the Pacific Northwest, specifically around this forest. They discovered that in addition to Mike and Diana and Ruth and Steven, there were 4 other sets of couples that were killed in and around this forest, and all of them bared striking resemblances to one another. The most recent attack that is associated with the tube sock killer occurred in 2006, but the reality is police don't really know anything about the tube sock killer. All they know is that they're probably in the Pacific Northwest, and they are definitely still at large. So that's going to do it. Keith and Diane grew up in the same town, London, Ohio, which was a very rural, small town in the middle of Ohio. They were high school sweethearts, and after high school, they would end up getting married. Fast forward 6 years, and Keith and Diane have been married for 6 years. They have a daughter named Raven, who's 4 years old, and Diane has just found this beautiful new home in London, Ohio, so same place they grew up, that was a little more isolated than any other properties they were looking at. It was still within London, Ohio, but it was in the forest. It was way off the beaten path, so to speak. But, Keith was a hunter and he loved the forest, and, Diane loved the forest too, so they liked the idea of having that privacy and kind of living away from other people. So very quickly they decide to buy the house, and they move in and they kind of settle into their new routine. At this time, Keith was not only working full-time during the day as a welder, but at night he was taking night classes to prepare for this apprenticeship program he was trying to get into. Keith is gone 5 days a week for 12 hours at a stretch, leaving Diane home alone with Raven when she wasn't at school. And Diane was a stay-at-home mom, so she was at this house a lot. So in those first couple of weeks that they had moved into this house and Diane's getting used to being alone quite a bit, Diane at night would hear what sounded like something she described as scampering. Some animal is moving around outside of the house. And from time to time she'd poke her head out. You know, she had this big window that sat over the kitchen sink. So whenever she was doing dishes, she'd be looking directly into their forest in their backyard, and she'd poke her head out and she'd try to get a glimpse of whatever it was. She just assumed it was, you know, a deer or a dog or something like that. It wasn't a cause for concern. It was just something she noticed within those first couple of weeks. One night, after she had put Raven to bed and Keith was still out at night school, Diane was cleaning up the downstairs and she was doing the dishes and she was looking out the window and she starts hearing that scampering sound. And as she's looking, you know, she's got light behind her from inside the house, causing kind of a glare on the glass. So she's up close to the pane of glass, kind of peering out to try to catch a glimpse of this deer or dog or whatever it was. And as she's looking out into the tree line, which is very close to her house, there's only a separation of maybe 20 or 25 feet from the edge of her house to the edge of the forest. And as she's looking, she swears she sees a set of eyes looking back at her. And to her, it immediately confirms that that's a dog. There's a dog that's gotten loose and that's what's been roaming around my property. She's not frightened. She's used to being out near the woods. So she's just like, okay, cool, it's a dog. And so she finishes the dishes and she goes into the living room, which is on the other side of the house. And as she's picking up toys and moving things around, she happens to look up towards the window in their living room that's looking basically in the other direction as that window above her sink. She's looking in the opposite direction. And to her horror, there is a set of eyes that are at human level that are right up against the glass. She only sees it for a second. She sees the reflection of the eyes before she backs away startled. But there's light on in the room she's in, so she doesn't have a great view of what's outside. And she's not even sure if she actually saw those eyes. She's not sure if she's scaring herself. So she goes back into the kitchen to look out that window and see if she can see those eyes that she had seen before that she believed belonged to a dog. She was hoping that they would be gone and that would kind of account for the eyes she just saw at the living room window, even though it would have been a very tall dog. She goes into the kitchen, she starts leaning towards the window, and then right as she's about to put her head almost against the glass, a head comes right in front of her on the opposite side of the glass with these glowing gold eyes looking right at her. She's horrified. She practically falls over and she's looking up from the ground and there's this face looking in the window directly at her. And she's scampering back like on the ground, getting out of the kitchen. And right at that moment, she hears car tires out on the driveway. And it's Keith. Oh my God, Keith's gonna run into somebody that's outside. She hears the door open and she's just praying it's Keith, and sure enough, he calls out and he sees her on the ground in the living room and he's like, what's going on? And so she immediately tells him she definitely saw somebody outside. She thought it was a dog, maybe it wasn't. And Keith, he's a hunter, you know, he knows they're out in the woods. They've just moved into this house. He's thinking maybe my wife is actually a little bit scared to be so isolated out here. Keith goes outside with a flashlight. He's looking all around. He's walking the property. He can't find tracks. He can't see anything. And so he comes back inside and he never really believed that it was anything other than maybe her imagination or just some random animal outside. And so he's just telling her like, hey, I know we just moved in. I'm sure you're stressed. You're here alone all the time. You know, you got this huge woods right next to our house. You're going to hear animals. I just wouldn't sweat it. It's probably nothing to worry about. She was not cool with being, you know, told don't worry about it because she knows what she saw. So a month goes by and Keith and Diane have stopped talking about whatever Diane saw. You know, there wasn't anything else happening at the house. She wasn't seeing eyes or animals, hearing any scampering sounds. It was just kind of back to normal. Keith is gone. He's going to night school and Diane's home by herself and she's in the kitchen. She's looking out that window. She doesn't hear any scampering or anything. And without any warning, she sees a set of eyes suddenly appear on the edge of the window just outside of the woods. She sees the eyes dead on and she backs up from the window. She's thinking to herself, I have to protect Raven. And her first thought is turn off all the lights in the house. That way it can't see me. And so she runs around the house, terrified, but knew she had to do it, turning off every light. The last light she turns off is the living room light, and she's up against the wall, and as she hits the light in the living room, making everything dark, she suddenly gets a clear picture out that living room window where she had seen the eyes as well the month earlier. And standing pressed against the glass is an absolute human figure with eyes at human level, these orange, glowing eyes at eye level, standing right against her window, looking in the window directly at her. Horrified, she starts making her way into the kitchen by sliding up against the wall. They have a landline phone that was hung in the kitchen. And so she gets to the phone, trying to keep an eye on that back window. She can see the side of this thing's silhouette. She calls 911 and says, there's someone outside my house, they won't go away. As soon as she hangs up, from her perspective, she can only see its shoulder. She watched the shoulder disappear out of her view. She poked her head back in the living room, and sure enough, it's gone. And as she's sitting there, it's silent. There's no sound in the house. She can hear clear scampering sounds, like running sounds outside of her house, as this thing is running all the way around her house. And she's sitting there wondering if this thing's gonna break a window to come inside, what would she even do? And so finally she sees the flashing lights of a cop car pulling into the driveway, and she hears the police knock at the door. She runs to the door, opens it up, and she's hysterical, and the police are trying to calm her down to just get the story of what's going on, and she's pointing out, saying there's something out there, and the police start looking around the property. Keith comes home, and he knows instinctively what's probably happened, because the police are scanning the property for something, and he's thinking she saw this thing again, whatever it is, it probably was just a reflection of herself in the glass, and now she's called the police. This is a small town. Keith is worried that people are going to think he's crazy, and so he comes in, and he regretted this, but he immediately got mad at his wife. Like, what are you doing? You're calling the cops, like, there's nothing here. I looked last time, they're looking now, and they were even saying, like, we haven't seen anything, we're gonna look for a little bit longer, but there's no sign of anybody being here. And at some point, the police are like, yep, we didn't find anything, and the police are like, let us know if anything else happens, and they leave. Keith and Diane are left just fighting. So 4 months go by without incident. There's no scampering outside, there's no eyes in the windows, and Keith and Diane have kind of moved past that whole ordeal, and they're, back to normal. They're really not even thinking about it. And even Diane would say, like, I did begin to believe that it was just in my imagination, and that I was just stressed and maybe overwhelmed at how often I was alone in that house, and it was just getting to me. And 4 months go by. It's early December of 1981, and it was the first big snowfall of the winter. And Keith wakes up one morning after the snowfall, a few inches on the ground, and he decides, because his family's still sleeping, that he's going to go out and he's going to get donuts and bring them back for the family, donuts and coffee. So it's still dark outside. He goes outside, starts up his car, he's rubbing his eyes, he's still tired, and he's adjusting his rear view mirror. And when he stops it for a second and he's looking up there, he thinks he sees somebody standing behind his car. What? And he readjusts it and he looks and it's gone. And so he throws the car in park, grabs his flashlight, and he starts looking around because he knows he just saw someone standing behind his car. And so he's walking around shining his light, and he's realizing the irony of this situation. This is the same situation that his wife was in, believing she saw somebody outside their house, looking for it, it's nowhere to be found. He just saw someone standing, saw the eyes of a person, standing behind his vehicle, can't find this person. And he's thinking, was there any truth in what she saw? Was I wrong? And so he's looking everywhere, and all of a sudden he sees tracks. He can't tell what kind of tracks they are, but there's clear prints in the snow. It's fresh snow. He knows where he had been walking, and he starts following them, thinking he's going to get to either a person or he doesn't know what. And he sees they stop right next to his house. And he's looking like, where could they have gone? And then he looks up to there was a first floor section of the house that was a little bit extended. So there was a roof that was at the first floor level, and then there was the rest of the house that was at the second floor level. And he sees that the footsteps go from the ground to the first floor roof, and then they go up to the second floor roof, and they go over to the other side of the house. Who's doing this? What's doing this? And so he starts going to the other side of the house, and he can't see any more prints. And he's looking up at the top of his house, and he's thinking, am I going crazy? Something's on my house? Like, what's going on? And so he goes inside and he calls his hunting buddy, Dennis, who's the only person that lives relatively close to them. And he's like, you gotta come over here right now. I got something weird going on. I think someone's stalking my house. I can't be sure. You gotta come over here. Dennis is like, I'll be there in a minute. When Dennis gets there, Keith's outside with his rifle. And Dennis is like, what are you doing? And he's like, somebody, and he shows him the prints, jumped on my roof. Someone's on my roof. I don't know what's going on, but someone I think is on my roof. And as they're talking about it, they hear what sounds like thump. Something just landed really hard from a pretty high distance. And it was on the other side of the house. They kind of run around, rifle, and Dennis had his rifle too. They go to the other side and they see like two clear footprints, but 20 feet away from the edge of the house. meaning this thing on the roof, if it jumped off, it jumped not only 2 stories to the ground, but it jumped 20 feet out away from the house as well, because there was no other footprints. And they just heard it land, and it ran off into the forest. And so Dennis and Keith look at each other, and Dennis is like, what do you want to do? And Keith's like, let's go after it. Now, Dennis and Keith, they hunt in these woods all the time. And they see right away that the footprints, the tracks of this person or creature or whatever it is, they're about 14 inches long, and it appears to be a bipedal creature. It does not appear to be on 4 legs. Something's moving on 2 legs. And they're thinking about just how would this person be able to get on the roof? What animal runs around that has a 14-inch track that runs on 2 legs? Like, they're not really sure what to make of it. Is it a person? Is it a creature? We don't know. And so they follow the tracks into the woods, and the whole time they have this awful sensation that something's watching them. And from time to time, they would hear something a ways away from them that sounded like a big animal moving in the forest, but they could never quite get to it in time. And at some point, they started hearing noises behind them. And they're thinking, like, is it possible that this thing has run ahead of us and then looped back around and is now tracking us? Like, they were feeling really uncomfortable. And as they're about to just kind of abandon this search, because they've been looking for this thing for hours, they keep following its tracks, they get to a clearing, and they find this tiny cabin that neither of them had seen before, right in the middle of the clearing. And they see that these tracks lead right up to it, and they follow the tracks up to the cabin, and the tracks stop right outside the door. There's one door leading into this cabin, and the door is shut. And they're thinking, like, what animal can open and shut doors? And so Dennis starts immediately hitting on the door, trying to get this person to come outside and show themselves. We know you were over at Keith's property. Get out here. We followed you here. We know it's you. There's no sound inside. There's no movement inside. They're looking in the windows. There's nothing. Keith realizes, like, it's a bad look for us to have tracked this person to their house. We have guns. Like, this is a bad look for us. We can't be here. We need to leave and just let this go. They have a couple more choice words, and then they leave. And they decide, instead of going back through the woods, they go to the nearest road that they could hear nearby. They go to the road, and they go to a payphone. They call Keith's father, who comes to pick them up. And when they hop in the car, Keith's dad is like, why do you have guns? And Keith and Dennis explain what happened, and they describe this cabin in the woods that they were just at. And Keith's dad is like, oh, I know who lives in that cabin. It's this guy who works at the tire shop. He's a loner type guy, older guy. No one really knows much about him. So Dennis is like, we got to go to that tire shop. I want to get a look at this guy. Keith's a little bit unsure, like he doesn't want to blow this out of proportion, but they ultimately decide that they're going to bring a beat up tire to this tire shop and ask to get it repaired, to try to get a look at this person who apparently owns the cabin. So they go to this tire shop. They know that the front desk attendant is not the guy who owns the cabin. It's the actual mechanic who's in back. And so they give the tire over, and the front desk guy yells back to George. Says, hey, George, come out here, you got a tire. And so Keith would describe George coming out of the shadows to get the tire. And he's like the 6'5" older guy who looks up at Keith and Dennis. And he's got these orange eyes. Keith would say it was the most distinctive set of eyes he'd ever seen. And he looks up at them, and George has a moment of recognition that he's looking at the 2 men that just tracked him to his house. And Dennis and Keith are looking at him thinking, we know it was you. And they both recognize it. George looks down, walks away with the tire. And then when he finishes whatever he's doing with the tire, he rolls it out to the middle of the floor to stay in the shadows. Keith and Dennis are like, he didn't want to show himself again. He knows that we know he's the guy. Dennis and Keith leave and think, man, like, that's so weird. He's an old guy. I mean, he kind of fits the description, I guess. You know, he's a big guy, 14-inch tracks. That could be him. But none of it really added up. I mean, he's an older guy. How's he getting on the roof? Keith is like, I can't tell police what happened because I would have to admit that I stalked him to his house with a gun. That's how I know he's there, and he didn't commit a crime. At least I can't pin him to a crime. And so he can't tell the police. He doesn't want to tell his wife because his wife not only would have a big told you so moment, he knew that she would immediately want to leave, like move. And he did not have the financial resources to move. And so he decides to just kind of keep it to himself and hope that he does not run into George again. So for a few months, there's no sightings of anything strange happening at their house, at Keith and Diane's house. But in March of 1982, 3 months after their encounter with George at the tire shop, Dennis shows up at Keith's house. And he says, hey, get in, I want to show you something. And so Keith gets in Dennis's car and they start driving, and Keith can tell that Dennis is taking him towards this cabin in the woods where George lives. And Keith says to Dennis, we can't do this. We cannot go to this guy's house. We know he did it, but what are we gonna do? And Dennis goes, no, I just found out that George died. He's dead. So we can just go check it out right now. We can go check out his residence. And Keith is like, I feel bad about it, but okay, let's go check it out. And so they start driving down this one access road that would lead to George's cabin, and they find a cop car is sitting in the middle of the road. It would turn out that Dennis knew the cop, and he explained the whole strangeness behind this cabin and how it related to them. And the cop at first was very reluctant to give any information about why he was there or what was going on at the cabin, but ultimately he relented and said, actually, you know, I'm here because there's some strangeness with the cabin. We don't really know what to make of it, and you know, if you want to, I can give you a quick peek of what the cabin looks like. Keith and Dennis are like super intrigued, and they're like, okay. And so they go into this cabin, and there's nothing in it. There's basically a chair and a table, but that's it. There's no personal effects, there's no food, there's nothing. It's just this empty, tiny space. And Keith and Dennis are, you know, shocked. They're like, wow, this guy was living like a hermit, basically. And they thought that that was what the cop was referring to when he said there's some weirdness with this cabin. They're like, man, that's crazy. You know, George, how did he live like this for 40 years? Crazy. And the cop's like, no, that's not the weird part. He goes, that's the weird part. And he points at a sheet that's hanging down inside of the cabin. The cop goes over and pulls the sheet aside, and it revealed a metal door, a sliding door, and they slid it open, and immediately they're hit with this wet dog smell, like kind of a gross wet dog smell. And they go into this cell that had plate steel lining the walls with metal strips and rivets holding everything in place. It was like this metal encased tomb that they were in. And in the middle of the floor was a 10-foot chain link, and at the end there were shackles for wrists and for feet. And on the wall were all these scratch marks, old and new, all over the walls. And so the police officer's like, yeah, we're trying to figure out what old George was doing with this cell in his cabin in the middle of the woods. Keith and Dennis, they leave and they go back into their car and they're driving away, and neither of them are even talking about what they saw. But they know that something that was being held in that cage in the cabin had been the thing they had stalked. It had been the thing that had been stalking their property, Keith's property. It was the thing that was staring in the windows. It's all very unsettling. But Keith, Dennis, Diane never found out what it was. Keith would say, though, that there was no more stalking at his property once George had died. They never saw the eyes again. So no matter what this was, something was showing up at Keith and Diane's house and looking in the windows and, you know, stalking them. And something made tracks, got on the roof of Keith and Diane's house, ran into the woods, and made its way back to George's cabin. Now, we don't know if that something was just George, or if it was some creature, some animal that was in that cage, or if it was something else. So let me know in the comments what you think it was and what happened, and I'll do my best to get... Hey, 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 hey.
Came in red, like a match to silk. Turned my quiet room into a rush of guilt. Your shoes on top, the sharp little sound. I forgot my name when you spun around. Hey, you look right through me, like you know the code. deeper into the fray. The chaos beckons. Is it real or just my fear? So where am I supposed to go? Where can I go? Mad world, this madness, it pulls me.
Guys, if you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please go on a walk with the like button in northeastern Australia and push them into a Gimpy plan. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is